Okay. All right. So the whole idea of this was an overview of what democracy is. Let me just see if I can do one other thing. Okay. So this is the starting point. I decided I would use Abraham Lincoln as the beginning of this thing. Democracy is the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And it comes from the Lincoln Gettysburg Address, but it's probably as succinct a version that has ever been put together, because it is a government of the people. It's dealing with those of us that live within it. By the people, we're the ones that are supposed to be responsible for creating democracy. And it's for the people, not only those that are part of the country to start with, but those that become part of the country. And this is part of a dedication, so it has this extra ring to it as far as I look at things. And I don't know that there's any conversation. I'm not muting anybody. So if you have something you want to say, please pop up at any time and volunteer. So this is sort of where I started beyond Abraham Lincoln. Basic sense of democracy as a form of governance rests on its etymology as ruled by the entire people, rather than, as Shapiro puts it, by any aristocrat, monarch, philosopher, bureaucrat, expert, or religious leader. So it goes back to this idea of the people. So you don't have an individual that's responsible for the government, and regardless of the various categories. And even though there seems to be some suggestion of the last 20 to 40 years that maybe this attitude has changed, the basic point of it is still the same. And just the use of the word per se, democracy, as it's broken down into its original Greek forms, leads itself to this no aristocrat, monarch, philosopher, bureaucrat, expert, or religious leader. So we're supposed to be led by some form of government that's provided by the people themselves, that bring things to it, take things from it, and are supporting of it. I put down not cynical because potentially, given the fact that this was defined, now it's 90 years ago, that democracy is government by the people, that form of government in which the sovereign power resides in the people as a whole and is exercised either directly by them or by officers elected by them. So it's not cynical. It's a form of government. Sovereign power resides in the people as a whole. That's the whole point of it. Exercised either directly by them or by officers elected by them is one of the differences that pops up in looking at the various types of democracy. One of the issues that came up during the early days of the United States was the idea that what kind of a government do you want to have? Do you want to have a legitimate direct democracy, which in effect means that every person directly elects or enacts every single law? Or do you want to create this Republican kind of government that we have, where you elect officers that then deal with the laws? Excuse me. And this is one of the things that came into definite interest around the time of the French Revolution, which is right around the time of the creation of the Constitution, is people like Jefferson were highly in favor of a more broad democratic environment. And others, more like Hamilton, were opposed to it, more interested in the idea of a federal kind of system that's in effect now. And as the French Revolution sort of devolved into the Reign of Terror, the idea of allowing all of the people to have an equal vote became more and more noxious in terms of looking at it. Here's another definition that I used. And again, I encourage you, if you have something you want to add or say, please do so. But a constitution may be defined as the organization of a city in respect of its offices generally, but especially in respect of that particular office which is sovereign in all issues. In democratic cities, for example, the people is sovereign. And the reason for the Greek in there is this is looking at sort of the earliest way of looking at things. This is a translation of Aristotle that was made, 20 some odd years ago. Then it continues, when the masses govern the city with a view to the common interest, the form of government is called by the generic name of constitutional government. Democracy is directed to the interest of the poor only, not to the interests of everyone. And that's an insert that was put in there. Now, the thing that you look at this, it sounds as if it's very broad-based. But in reality, when it says in democratic cities, the people is sovereign, that's a period of time when these were first created, when the people themselves represent, or the voting people, if you will, represented a very small percentage of the population, as is always the case until the early 1920s. Women had no form of involvement in government, except for rare places at rare times. And the people that were allowed to be part of the demos, the people that were sovereign, were a very small percentage of the populations overall. So Aristotle's version of things was sounding very more grandiose than they were in reality. Another version, and this is a couple of interesting people in terms of who they are and what they say. John Calhoun wrote, democracy is not majority rule. Democracy is diffusion of power, representation of interests, recognition of minorities. And this brings into focus, I think, one of the sort of critical aspects of the creation of the Constitution, the attitudes of people like John Calhoun over time. But the idea that majority rule is not the whole point of it. It's the ability to have power in a variety of different hands, different representation of interests, and recognition of minorities. And one of the things that was eventually built into the Constitution was the idea that, yes, majority ruled in a lot of ways, but never to the lack of understanding that minorities had rights and needed to be recognized. Now, the reason this becomes interesting in the case of John Calhoun is Calhoun was a member of the Senate. Calhoun was a vice president of the United States, and Calhoun was the promulgator of an idea called nullification. And that idea was that any law that was passed by the federal government could potentially be negated by a state government. And Calhoun's time frame is in the middle of the 19th century. So this is well after the Constitution was passed. It was at a point in time, by the time he's writing these things, that the Supreme Court had become much more like the Supreme Court of today, in that it decided that federal law was able to overrule any state law if it was in violation of a federal rule. And eventually the concept of nullification leads to the concept of secession, and in a sense leads to the Civil War at a very small level. Sort of on the opposite side of an extreme is H.L. Mencken, who was one of the better or more acerbic critics during the middle part or early middle part of the 20th century. Democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. Now, this is the cynical view of what democracy is. The theory that people know what they want. The idea that common people, and whatever way you want to look at common people, but it's basically the mass of people that live within any society. They know what they want, okay? They want low taxes, but they want more government support. And it could be written in the period of time we were either at the end of the recession or the beginning of Roosevelt's years. And once they make these ideas known, what they want, Mencken feels they deserve to get it good and hard. In other words, whatever they really think they want, maybe they should think it through a little bit more. So you get this attitude of somebody who's looking at the reality of implementations and the changes that have gone on. And if it is a period of time when you move from the recession, the Depression, when all of these great economic theories became a problem and all the people that wanted to get rich didn't get rich. And while now on breadlines, this idea of getting it good and hard, to me, just really stands out in a sense. Another name you probably know, George Bernard Shaw, and he wrote, "Democracy, substitution of election by the incompetent, many for appointment by the corrupt few." So if Mencken is snide about what he thinks, Shaw is very specific on what he believes, that the people that rule in a democratic kind of environment are the ones that are the most correct. The substitution of election by the incompetent. He believes that the mass of people that do these elections, bring people into office, shouldn't be, in a sense, allowed to. And if you look at Shaw's belief system, he was what was called a Fabian, sort of a leaning towards socialism, but he was also leaning towards a form of anarchism. For those of you, actually, Josie's the only one that goes to my history stuff. We've talked about anarchism over the last few weeks. But in a sense, Shaw believed that there was a possibility for there to be a socialistic kind of environment where individuals could move in their own way and somehow avoid the need for any kind of substantial government. This other person, Brzezowski, whose name, who I don't really know, but I like this definition. It's a system in which parties lose elections. There are parties, divisions of interest, values and opinions. There is competition organized by rules, and there are periodic winners and losers. Now, this, in a sense, is really a very good definition, but it seems to be the kind of thing that is somewhat falling apart over the last 20 to 40 years. But if you think about it, there are parties. People associate together. Just as a one aside or quote, John Adams, our second president, at one point in time had said he did not believe political parties should ever be created, that they would be the end of democracy as he viewed it. But the parties do have divisions of interest, values, and opinions. There is competition. The organized by rules is the one that really comes into question. Is yes, it used to be that there were rules and everybody more or less played by them. There seems to have been, over the last 20 years, the idea that maybe these rules don't apply to those that are out of power, regardless of which party they're in. And there are periodic winners and losers, and that's absolutely true. Just think of any election. But now there's this question of, is a winner really a winner? And how are we going to determine who can vote for which parties and how those parties will either win or lose elections? So a lot of these definitions that were written in various periods of time and were directed at more or less very specific events or periods of time or attitudes are ones that come into play in the 20th, 21st centuries because of the, what I will call the movement away from compromise into more very disparate differences in opinions and attitudes. One of the interesting things I think is the origination of what was going on. The founding fathers designed our system of government. One of the key ideas was that some of its components should be more accountable to public opinion and others less. So the idea is we have the House of Representatives. Those people have to run for re-election every 2 years. In a real world, in a world that was very democratic, the House of Representatives members would go into the House, and their job would be to represent the people that had put them in office. But because of, and the world has changed certainly since the founding fathers put this together, but it seems as if the House of Representatives spends more of its time running for re-election than they do for doing something of value. The other thing that popped up is the other side of this is Supreme Court justices were given life tenure. And nowadays, people look at that and say, is that realistic? You have people that are on the court that are very old, maybe older than they should be. You wind up it becoming much more politicized than it was before. You also have one of the earliest arguments in terms of creating the Supreme Court was should there have been a third part of the government? Should there have been an executive and legislative only, or should there be a Supreme Court? And then part of the rationale for some of the courses or classes coming up are the idea that the original Supreme Court justices really were kind of benign and didn't do very much. And it wasn't until John Marshall becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court gets the kind of political impact or governmental impact, a better phrase, that it had before and has now. And in between these two, life tenure versus 2 years, were the senators that were chosen by state legislatures for 6-year terms. Now, most people that haven't done, well, I think most people don't realize that until the beginning of the 20th century, senators were not voted on by the people. They were selected by the state legislatures. So what that meant was whatever party was in charge or in control of the state governments, at least, or the state senators, they were the ones that would go to government, federal government, as senators. So they represented the power base within each of the states, which meant that their voting was more party-oriented than necessarily more individually oriented. So the whole concept changed. Once it went to a direct election, as was and has been and still is the House of Representatives, then you wind up with this much more politicized version of it, because now there's this constant running against each other. And then in between these, you had the idea of the Electoral College meeting every 4 years in order to select a president. And as I said earlier, one of the discussions we'll have is the idea of the Electoral College, why it was put together, how it's existed, and then hopefully comments related on whether or not it should be eliminated. And if it is to be eliminated, how would you change it? What system would you put in place? A second thing related to the United States, they were originally expected to represent the states as the states. So in a sense, if a senator was sent to government, the probability was, even though they're being elected in a sense every 6 years, unless it was a drastic change in the state government, they would probably be representing what the state's interests are. And it certainly is one of those things that seems to be fairly constant. The idea of Joe Manchin is probably as good a name as any. He's there and representing his state as he thinks they think. Whether or not that's valid is something that would have to be done in detail. And the kind of extension to that line is represent the states almost in the sense of being ambassadors to Washington, which, and the states had more sovereignty at the time of the Constitutional Convention than they have now. And the meetings of the Constitutional Convention is part of what we'll talk about. But there you really had state interests being presented. The states would be more or less in one mind as to what they wanted to do. Excuse me. New York, for example, was basically being represented by Alexander Hamilton at the time. And he knew, or at least he thought he knew, what New York wanted at the time of the Constitutional Convention. Now, the things started to change when voting requirements or voting attitudes changed. There were two things that were done in 1913. One was the changing of how senators are elected, which I already mentioned, but the legislators were out and people were elected directly by the voting public. The result was emasculate the states, eliminate much of their sovereignty. So the states sort of felt as if they were being put into second-class citizenship compared to where they were before. They no longer had ambassadors. They had people that were working to, in a sense, extend or improve the federal government. Well, this emasculation of the states and much of their sovereignty seems to be going back in terms of a cycle, given the way the various Senate leaders seem to be looking at how the government should be run and how it can be operated. Just a simple headline that we've seen a number of times over the idea of trying to eliminate the filibuster sort of deals with this same kind of an issue. So it's kind of an interesting curve from one point to another over a little bit over 100 years. Third message related to the United States. The idea originally was there was going to be one representative for X number of people in a given area. And previously, new congressional seats had been added from time to time because of population growth, new states coming into the Union. One of the things we lose sight of, I think, is that during the middle to latter part of the 19th century, there was this huge growth in population. As Irish came in, Italians came in, Eastern Europeans came in, and states got more and more people, more and more states were added, and therefore more and more congressional seats were added. The number of House members grew from 65 in the year 1790 to 223 in 1850. So in 60 years, you had over a tripling of the number of members in the House. And then between 1850 and 1910, you have not about a better than 150%, but you have a big growth. And then in 1913, the whole idea of changing the way government is controlled changed. The election of senators by direct vote and the number of congressmen, congresspeople is probably more politically correct, has been capped at 435. So that says, regardless of how big a state gets, California and New York are two examples, that the number of representatives they had, once the number was capped at 435, has never increased, even though California's population has certainly grown. But New York's probably is about the same as it was for quite a while. But it changed the balance potentially within the House of Representatives. And if you take a state like California, which last number I remember seeing was it has the 7th largest economy in the world, you would think something with that much financial economic clout would have that much political clout. And yet it doesn't because of this limit or set cap. A couple of other people worth talking about is Thomas Jefferson, where he says a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49. Now, that's the democracies he's talking about is the one that was put into effect in the United States because one of his versions of democracy, and as I said, Jeffersonian democracy is a separate subject that I hope to get to. But what he's saying is that if you get 51 of the people to vote for something, some person, the other 49% don't have a voice. In a sense, that's a misreading of the Constitution, but it's also the idea that he doesn't believe that the Constitution, the way it was structured, was the way he would have liked it to have been. Woodrow Wilson, who in one way or one sense basically violated basic principles of democracy during the First World War, but he says democracy is not so much a form of government as a set of principles. Well, if you think about Wilson, what are those set of principles? You look at the, I forgot what they called now, but the 12 items he put together in looking at the League of Nations. But a set of principles is not really what the Constitution consists of. It consists of a series of things that you're supposed to do. And there are some clauses in there, some purposely, some maybe not so purposely, to allow for modification of things as the world changes, as the technology changes, and as more people get involved with it. And the reason I point out Woodrow Wilson as, in a sense, violating that set of principles is during the First World War, he basically made German Americans and Italian Americans non-citizens in a broad sense of the term. Another very famous president is Franklin Roosevelt. Democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard of democracy, therefore, is education. And this is, I think, a valid statement. If you don't have an educated populace, if people don't know what things are right or wrong, if people look at things from a subjective, uneducated point of view, then democracy, in my mind, cannot survive, cannot thrive. And the other phrase in there, cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. This suggests that when you go and nominate somebody for office, or somebody is elected to office, that you've chosen them not because of political affiliation. You're not choosing because of something you dislike, but you're choosing the person because of their qualities, their capabilities, the fact that they are above other people in terms of what they're willing to accomplish. One of the reasons for the expectations from the Electoral College, at least from people like Hamilton view, and I think Jefferson as well, was that when the time came to nominate somebody for president, that there would be so many good candidates, so many valid candidates, that the Electoral College would never be able to choose one, and that all presidential elections would wind up in the House of Representatives, which was the way the Constitution was set up. Now, as we all know, that did not turn out to be the way. If you go through all of the presidential elections in history, you always find a number, well, there are always a number of people on the ballot, probably more so now in the last 50 years than before. But if you look at, say, Lincoln's election, there were 4 different people running for president, 3 of them that were considered Democrats. And that's why Lincoln won as a Republican. A different Republican Party than exists today, but that's a separate story, one I go back and forth with when I talk about Jeffersonian democracy. But the whole point of it was that the concepts that were held in 1786, 7, 88, 89, leading to the Constitution, were so different than the reality that went on over years. Okay, so one of the things that I was looking at is the system better or worse by directly electing senators? Is it really a bad thing that the number of representatives is no longer expandable? And does the checks and balances system in the Constitution still work, make sense? Now, I know Josie's out there. I know there are 2 other people out there, Beverly and Nancy. Do you have an opinion on any of these? Would you like to voice an opinion? You've heard mine, actually. Okay, the checks and balances system, the whole idea of we'll start and do it this way, but the executive says we need to raise taxes on something, and they send it down to the Congress to deal with it. The Congress comes up with a method of dealing with increasing taxes. And the House passes it, the Senate passes it, goes back to the president, and he signs it. And then it goes out for implementation, and somebody somewhere, maybe the court itself, takes a look at it and says, no, you can't do this because it violates section whatever of the Constitution. So you do have this whole system of you can't make unilateral decisions. The president can't say, this is the rule, and everybody has to follow it. The Senate or the Congress or the Senate and / the House of Representatives can't make rules that go and change things without the approval of the other portions of government. And the judicial department, the Supreme Court, cannot go out and make a law and assume that the executive and the legislative will allow it to happen. So this whole idea of checks and balances that has worked so well for so many centuries now is, I think, becoming questionable. So in all of these various three opinions, system better or worse by directly electing senators, I guess in my mind, the answer is, I think it's about the same, because one way or the other, you still get very specific state attitudes that are being presented, even though they potentially are more personalized. But if you were to look back at voting records of senators from the same party in the same state, they probably vote pretty much the same. Is it a bad thing that the number of representatives in the House is no longer expandable? My mind, yes. I think the larger states should have a larger representation in what goes on a federal level. And though checks and balances system still work, makes sense, I think it does, but I think it's fallen into a form of misuse that needs to be corrected. And hopefully, this is my last definition. Democracy provides opportunity for effective participation, equality in voting, gaining enlightened understanding, exercising final control by the people over the agenda, and inclusion of adults. Political institutions that are necessary to pursue these goals are elected officials, free, fair, and frequent elections, freedom of expression, alternative sources of information, associational autonomy, and inclusive citizenship. If you go to the two groups of these things, democracy needs effective participation. Effective, to me, participation means as many people that are educated as possible understand the circumstances being involved, that everybody's vote is equal, that there shouldn't be a methodology put in place that eliminates certain people from being able to vote. Gaining enlightened understanding, that becomes increasingly difficult in a world of mass media, social media, different ways of people expressing themselves. And then exercising final control by the people over the agenda and the inclusion of adults. So I'm not sure when this was first written, but it certainly suggests that women are included in this definition. But exercising control over the agenda, well, who is the one doing that? That's not very obvious. But the goals are elected officials, okay? Free, fair, and frequent elections probably do have that. Freedom of expression, that's also basically allowed. But once you get to alternative sources of information, you get into the modern times when you wind up with how much information is viable, how much of it is valid. Do you allow pretty much anything to go out publicly? Or do you modify the First Amendment to say, you really can't yell fire in a crowded room? And some of these alternatives potentially can lead to that. Associational autonomy, you can belong to any group you want, even if you don't agree with them, and I think that's still fair. Inclusive citizenship goes back to freedom of expression and inclusion of adults. Everybody that has a period of time in the country should, I think, have a right to vote. So this, to me, this last definition covers a whole range of things that are both important. I think the reality of them has changed, but the meaning of them hasn't changed. I'm sorry, the type is getting very small, so I'm going to have to get close to read it. But there are different types of democracies. And that was sort of my point very beginning. There's face-to-face democracy, where ancient Greece, leaders would get together and they would decide for the rest of the polity, rest of the city-state, what laws were going to be in effect, how they were going to be enforced. And then you have similar things that happened in New England, the town meetings, and there are other places that have had town meetings as well. But people would get together, they would mutually decide what went on, and everybody that went to the town meeting had a voice. And there were some situations, I believe, in New England, where women did have a voice, or at least were able to present ideas. There's what was called, or is called, democracy by petition. And this was to be used only at state or local levels of government. Something like Proposition 11 came from a petition saying we need to change things, reduce property taxes. And it was, in a sense, a petition goes into the government. They take a look at it. The rules are that X number of people have to sign. If X number of people sign, then it goes on to either a current ballot coming up, or there's a referendum, which is rarely used. You also have the idea of recall. If you have somebody in a governmental position, they can be recalled. And we've had two versions of that in California over the last, 30 years, one of which was successful, one of which failed. And then you have this potential change in things, which I called, or somebody called, electronic democracy. Indirect representative democracy in the republic, much as what we have here. Protection of rights of minorities, giving everybody the right to vote. Widespread distribution of power so that no person or group of people has all the power. One of the things I toyed with over the past 2 years was putting together something that sort of dealt with this kind of attitude. Requires elections giving voters significant choices. Try to give people the right to vote either on specific rules and regulations that you want to put in effect, or narrowing them down through a series of elections. And if you're doing it electronically and you have the software and the protections in place to make sure they're not tampered with, it can be an interesting way of moving forward. So that requires widespread participation in decision-making and majority rule for some decisions. There could be situations where you have to have more than a majority. In some situations, you might even decide that if enough people want something to happen, if it seems to benefit the majority, that maybe it could be put into place. Other forms of government, and there are probably more than this, but tyranny. And it's an interesting word because the word tyranny now has a completely negative connotation. But if you go back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, or ancient Greece more than Rome, the tyrant was potentially somebody that was put in a position for a short period of time in order to control a specific problem. And once that problem was over, then the tyrant would be eliminated. That's not to say that some tyrants didn't stay in position. And the same kind of definition goes to dictatorship. in Rome, particularly when there were needs to have somebody very strong running the government or controlling the country, they would create a dictator for the length of time the issue existed. But after the problem passed, the dictator would give up his position. Julius Caesar sort of falls into that category. Despotism is more or less a result from some kind of monarchical leadership or single person leadership, or even an oligarchical leadership. Monarchy is certainly something that's been in place, but you have constitutional monarchies, you have limited monarchies, you have single rule monarchies. Virtually all have disappeared, and that I can think of anyway. Totalitarianism, examples of that would be Soviet Union during Stalin's years, Nazism, absolute rule, authoritarian rule are pretty much the same things, but people use different terms. And I guess if you look at the detailed definition, they vary somewhat. You have autocracy, another way of saying one person rule, but it also could be the rule of a triumvirate, again, going back to maybe ancient Rome, where you had the triumvirate that came together after Caesar was murdered. And then you have a theocracy, where the church rules things. And the papal states that virtually disappeared at the end of the 19th century were an example of theocracy. And the Vatican per se is still an example, but the country is so small as to be relatively unimportant. Okay. Are there places and or times where a non-democratic form of government makes sense? And this is, to me, an interesting question. And again, if you have an opinion, would like to make a comment about it, that's perfectly the right thing to do and the time to do it. Well, if you look at the form of that, I'll go to a couple of examples. And I don't necessarily agree that it worked out for the best for everybody. But when the Bolshevik Revolution took place in 1917, and there was a new form of government, it definitely was non-democratic. The government that came into place in 1905 never really got control of what it wanted to do. And it lent itself to this second revolution, the revolution of 1917. And Lenin, as he took control of the government, with sort of his number one man being Trotsky and moving into immediate civil war, didn't have the ability or the interest in turning his form of communism into reality until a few things were done. One of which would be the end of the Civil War, but two would be trying to educate the people. So it probably made sense for somebody like Lenin in the initiation phases of the Soviet Union. If you look at some other places where there are a non-democratic form of government, the question is, does it make sense? Saudi Arabia would be a good place to look. Saudi Arabia is a kingdom. It has some form of legislation underneath, but in a sense, the ruling family rules all. And what would happen if this turned into a true democracy in any of its other forms? Would the country still operate properly, I guess is a word that might make sense? Or does it make sense for them to do something differently? The new Afghanistan probably is a place where a democratic form of government would make sense, but there's a country that has a history going back to the beginning of recorded time, basically, where the government has been run by warlords in variety of areas. And the warlords have changed allegiances from time to time, place to place. Can be a friend with one and an enemy to the same one within years. And if you're a centralized government you find that you really can't control them. So what kind of government do you form in that case? It seems to be something that needs to be unique and specific to that particular country. And the last example I'll even suggest is that if you look at some of the countries in Africa, which were formed sort of arbitrarily, either at the end of the First World War or earlier, based on invasiveness or colonialism, you wind up with locations in which the tribal makeup of the areas are so different that the people themselves don't get along. And so do you split those up into separate states, which is probably the most logical thing, or do you figure out some other form of government that makes sense? Parliamentary democracy is probably the one that's most used outside of the United States. So the definition is government is appointed by parliamentary representatives as opposed to a presidential rule by decree dictatorship. So presidential rule by decree dictatorship is probably a little bit of an overstatement, but under a parliamentary democracy, government is exercised by delegation to an executive ministry and subject to ongoing review, checks and balances by the legislative parliament elected by the people. So I'll go from the bottom up. You still have in a parliamentary democracy the idea that people elect representatives to government. This morning I was talking about a novel that takes place prior to some increase in voting in England. And England is the parliamentary democracy I'm thinking about. But the government has the right to listen to these laws, create ministries, and deal with exercising what the people want. And they don't have a president per se. In England, you obviously have the Queen, and the Queen is a figurehead that can suggest, can advise, but really has no power in law. The parliament itself is made up of two houses, similar to the United States. The most powerful person in that government is the prime minister. And until, I guess it's about 140 years ago, the House of Lords had the ability to basically veto anything that came out of the House of Commons, but that's changed dramatically. So the House of Commons basically rules the government, with the House of Lords having some veto capability. But it's a variation where you don't have the same kind of executive as you have within the United States. And that is used, France is an example that's similar. Canada is similar. The communist version of it, which is sort of gone except for variations of it in China and in Vietnam, North Korea, certainly. Within more Marxist orthodoxy, there is a hostility to what is commonly called liberal democracy, which they simply refer to as parliamentary democracy because of its often centralized nature. Because of their desire to eliminate the political elitism they see in capitalism, Marxists, Leninists, and Trotskyites believe in direct democracy implemented through a series of communes, which are sometimes called Soviets. Now I'm going to go back to some discussions I've been having in my history class for the last probably 3 or 4 weeks, but certainly the last 2. There was an evolution in socialism that eventually wound up in Lenin's hands because of his first implementation. But one of the belief systems that really came from Proudhon more than anyone else is the idea that there would be these communes that were built up. Within the communes, everybody would have an equal vote in what was going to happen. And over a period of time, as these communes were solidified, they would link with other communes. And there would be this ability to govern an entire world through the interaction of these communes. And by doing this, if they were able to truly put this into effect, there would be no political elitism that capitalism had. where those with money sort of controlled government. Those without money were subject to those with money. So Trotskyists, it probably should be Trotskyites, they believe in this direct democracy. And if you do it, or if it was doable, is more accurate, within a limited society, then maybe it's doable. But Marxism, Leninism, Trotskyism, any other of the socialisms never really brought into consideration the idea that there are people that are more aggressive and more capable than others, and that those people were not going to be willing over time to tag everybody along with them. And Stalin, who basically takes over the Soviet Union in 1929, he realizes that the goals of the idealistic socialists is not going to happen. The goals are not going to happen. And he puts in a dictatorship of himself that has a coterie of people that will either advise or try to advise, and that the idea of this direct democracy will never take place. I brought up Proudhon's name a minute ago, but anarchists oppose direct democracy while others favor it. This is a discussion I also had over the last 2 weeks. But Proudhon argued the only acceptable form of direct democracy is one in which it is recognized that majority decisions are not binding on the minority, even when unanimous. And that definition is really anarchy. If everybody says that this is the way things should be, and you as an individual say, no, it doesn't apply to me, well, that's the only acceptable form of direct democracy. It's basically saying the minority or even the individual can control things. And anarchists believe that each individual had a right to do anything they want at any time they want. They did believe that there were certain moral laws that should be followed, but they didn't believe that there should be any kind of organized governmental entity that controlled what was being said and when it was being said. This is a word that doesn't usually pop up a lot. I don't know if I've seen it, but the word sortition, sometimes called democracy without elections, process of choosing decision makers via a random process. The goal is that those chosen will be representative of the opinions and interests of the people at large and be more fair and impartial than an elected official. The technique was widespread in Athenian democracy, still used in modern jury selection. It is not universally agreed that sortition should be considered democracy due to the lack of actual elections. So if I just skip to the middle of that, if you think about how jury selection is made, the X number of people are called for sitting on a jury. And regardless of what the jury is adjudicating, you go through a series of questions and they say whatever they are. And based on the opposing attorney's decisions, X number of people or 12 people are chosen, maybe 14 people, maybe 6 or 8, depending on what kind of trial it is. And it's sort of arbitrary as to how they're chosen. But the group of people that are brought in the pool are based on some standard thing. In the case of the United States, you're a registered voter. Another, in the Athenian democracy, it may have been that you were just known as one of the people that were voters. So is it a form of democracy without elections, or is it some interesting potential way of doing something via a random process? And maybe it has some way of taking some of the ideas and fitting it into a futuristic system. This was done when I first put this together, had never been presented before, but it was early on in the 21st century. Once weapons of mass destruction was discounted, it became a war for democracy. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at things. The Iraqi war started because of 9/11. And the theory was that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and that's why we had to go in and take over the country. Once it was realized, whoops, there were no weapons of mass destruction. They didn't have them stockpiled anywhere. Well, you were still there. What do you call it? Call it a war for democracy. And the reason I put down, can you think of, are there any examples that you can think of? And if you go back in history, there are any number of them, some of which were also instituted by the United States, is bringing gunboat democracy, or diplomacy is a better word, into China in the early 1920s. The involvement of the United States in various parts of Latin America and South America, the involvement of the Soviet Union in a variety of different places over a period of time, particularly at the end of the Second World War, when they were trying to turn Italy into another communist state, Greece into another communist state. And what they were presenting it as was a war for democracy, or a civil war for democracy. And then I don't know if it's my last question or not in this particular overview, but is democracy a cure-all for all? Is, if you look at all of the world, all of the situations in the world, and you look at all of the various governmental environments, China is an interesting example, because at some levels it's a monarchy, even though it's not a king, but it's ruled by an individual. But at other levels underneath it, there are people responsible for certain aspects of the government, which turns it from, I'll call it a monarchy again, or an autonomy, I guess, into an oligarchy. And then you deal with the financial aspects of things that are some controlled, some not controlled. It sounds as if they're getting more control. But is that a form of real democracy? Or are we looking at democracy from a very prismatic American point of view, or United States point of view? And in that particular situation, the circumstances are such that for that population, for that country, it makes the most sense. But then you bring in the questions of morality, of people's rights, and maybe that changes as well. So let me see if that's, well, there are more. Okay, I finally spelled democracy wrong one time. I'm sorry about that. Normally I have at least 3 typos when I do something, but there are other things to think about. One of the things that really has gone hand in hand over the last 2 centuries is the idea that democracy and capitalism are equal definitions in a lot of people's minds. That if you're in a capitalistic kind of society, that leads to democracy, because you wind up with people that want more and more in terms of economic equality, and democracy as electing people sort of leads to that. But I think there are some times when you say the word democracy and people think immediately of the economy. They don't think of it as a political system. The other thing that comes into any one of the decisions as to what kind of democracy there should there be democracy, is the historical backgrounds of the countries and ethnic groups in question. Going back to Russia as an example, if you look at Russia's history prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, it had been for about 550 years under the control of one autocrat, the Tsar, and his word was law, both for clerical and political aspects of the government. So that when a country is turned over completely from 1905 to 1917 and trying to deal with democracy or voting possibilities, you're coming from no background whatsoever. And it's not that surprising that it didn't work properly. And then you move forward into the Soviet era. And the reason it doesn't work again, and reason why somebody like Stalin is able to take single control, is because that's the way the history of the country has been and seems to be willing to do. And then you have the end of communism, now 30 years ago. And who do you have in place? You have Putin in place, who in a sense is the same, maybe not, he's the same in terms of position as Stalin was. He gets elected, but nobody gets elected by a 90% majority in real world democracies. So that's one way of looking at it. Other countries certainly have different backgrounds, different groups of ethnicity. I'll go back to China. If the Uyghurs were able to vote freely, would they vote to separate themselves from China? Or would they look for some different way of being considered part of the control of the entity itself? And that brings up the idea of democracy and capitalism, or democracy and economy, or method of government and economy. And then what are the goals of the people? What do the people want? And that's a function of how big the state is, how big the country is, and is the country itself homogenous? I brought up the idea of some African countries where they're not homogenous, but there are countries that are more, you think of as being homogenous, that aren't. Think of Spain. Spain has the Basques that would like to be separate from either France or Spain. You have the, can't think of the the word I want. It'll come to me when I'm finished. But in the northeast corner, in Barcelona, that would like to be separate. And then finally, the erosion of historical paradigms. We look back at the United States in 1789, and there's a constitution that's passed. This is a true example of how negotiations came together and created a document that, even though it's got its holes in it, and even though it's got archaic language in it, that until the last 20 years or so has been a thing you could look at as being a solid device for keeping the country together. And the founding fathers, the people that created the Constitution, recognized that over time there would be more people, over time there would be differences of activities, differences in technology that would have to be dealt with. But over time, have the ideals of the founding fathers been so eroded that we've lost sight of what the country should be and how it has gotten to where it is now? And is that true in the United States? Is it true in the United Kingdom? Is it true in France? Is it true throughout Western Europe? And is the whole idea of the Western canon being in a variety of levels, being displaced? And should it be displaced? Because the Western world has gotten too soft, too inconsiderate of every other thing than themselves, or too involved with making money rather than looking at equality in a variety of ways. And that is the end of the share. And we never had anybody else show up. Interesting. Okay. Anybody want to make any comment after I've rattled on?
Yes, I like to ask you a question.
Sure.
The system in Japan and England, are they the same, or is it somewhat different?
They're very similar. The emperor still is a figurehead within Japan. They have, as far as I remember, a bicameral legislature. So there are two houses that vote on things. The election process itself, I think, works the same way, where they elect representatives from the various prefectures that go into the Diet. So I think it's very similar. I'm sure there are some variations based on just historic attitudes within each country. Anybody, anything else? Okay, Nancy, Josie, Beverly, thank you for attending.
Thank you.
We'll see what happens next week. My intent, assuming we keep going, is to give you a background of where, what historically went on before the United States started to look at itself as a country. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you.
very welcome. Thank you for attending.